Hey guys, and welcome to the VDoor Locksmith show. I am so happy to have you guys watching today. We've got an amazing presentation for you guys. We've got Joe Dancy on the show today. He is a law professor as well as the SMU Spindle Top Fund Advisor at SMU. Joe, thank you so much for joining us today. I really do appreciate it. I can't apologize enough for 2 weeks ago when we had a little crash course session there and tried to do LinkedIn Live, but thank you so much today for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me. Actually, it's interesting to see the technology and how it's evolved. And I've watched a few of your little short programs between then and now. So it's sort of interesting to see how things evolve when you start broadcasting.
Yeah, it has been it's been a very trying time as far as trying to get all of this figured out. So, I'm doing my best as fast as I can, learning as quick as I can to be able to provide high quality content for everybody out there. So just kind of getting it rolling and seeing what we can do here. Looks like
interesting to see how things evolve when you start broadcasting.
Looks like nothing is showing live though. Hold on just a second.
All right, let me check on.
It's just a blank screen out there is what they're telling me.
Interesting. Okay.
Provide high quality content.
Oh, I got you.
Audio's going through, but the video portion is not.
Actually, I had the video on mine. I do have you and me are on the screen. So actually, it's a bigger picture than me than I'd really like. When you get older, you get the little miniature shot there in the corner. So yeah, you're a youngster. You can have the full screen, but.
Well, let me make sure here. Let's double check. I do have realized one thing as far as me being able to live stream and be able to check my phone as far as what's taking place out there. It is two different things as far as what's going on live, and then if I try to check it from my profile, if somebody else has got their LinkedIn profile like right here next to mine, and I can look at that, then that ends up being a better option than me looking at it through what I'm doing. So we'll double check something real quick here, and if everything's working good, we'll just go ahead and get on with the interview and stuff. I just don't want anybody to miss anything because you are such a wealth of knowledge. I don't want anybody to miss out on.
I don't know that. It's like, yeah. You talk to the students, they may or may not think that's. My classes are really very well received. Actually, I had the largest class at the University of Oklahoma Law School for this last year. I had 70 students in my class. The largest classroom they have has 75, and they originally put me in the classroom with 45. And the registrar said, "Hey, you can do one of two things. We can either move you to the big classroom, or we can tell people they can't take your class." And I said, "Hey, let's go to the big classroom. If they're interested, I want to talk to them." And it is interesting, David. One of the problems, and this is a huge issue for me personally, is that when you go out now and you see youngsters being college students and high school students, the oil and gas industry has an absolute terrible reputation. And most of those kids, you could tell them, "Hey, look, you can go be an engineer and work in the industry. You can go be a landman. You could do finance. You get a good job." And it's like they have no interest. They want to go, be a journalist. They want to go do something. I mean, they almost would sell used cars versus going in the oil and gas. And that's troubling to me. And that's why it's really important to me to be able to teach and to be able to come onto your show, although I'm really preaching to the choir, to be able to tell the story that this is, and it's not a stable industry. It's cyclical. You're going to have numerous jobs. And I've told my son, asked me, "Gee, how many times have you been laid off?" And I said, "Well, twice in the oil business." And I left once. It would have been just because it's cyclical. When they need you, they need you. When they don't, they don't. And if you're not adding value, unfortunately, that's. But the main concern they have is not the cyclicality, because they all know they go for these technology jobs. they all know, they're concerned about global warming, they're concerned about pollution, they're concerned about, all this stuff that I got to be careful how I say this. I'm not a climate skeptic. I'm Gregory Wrightstone, who's on LinkedIn. If you haven't read his book, you need to. A geologist, and essentially he makes the point that the climate change is a real issue. We are increasing our heat content, but it's small enough, and the models aren't really accurate. It's small enough, it's not going to cause a major problem short term. And secondly, sunspots, the heat from the sun has much more influence historically on a geological standpoint. And the cool thing talking to Gregory Wrightstone is, he goes back and he talks for the last 500 million years. And of course, all my students, they're all struck that, gee, we've never heard this before. We didn't know the global, this is the coolest the globe has been in quite some time, apparently. And, they don't know it's been so cyclical as far as climate. And then they hear that, and it's like, gee, there is another story to what we haven't been told here. And that's why they like me, although I got to make sure. The rumor is before they take my class that, gee, Dancy's a climate skeptic. He's one of those guys that doesn't believe in global warming. And I have to first thing be, hey, number one, you make your own decisions here. I'm not going to test you on whether you believe in global warming or not. But number two, I believe in global warming, but I don't think, there's a number of politicians who are running for office now who say that the globe's we're going to be extinct in 12 years because of global warming. And that's like incredible. It's like, if people can believe that, it's like, well, hell, why even go to college at all? Why should you and I be talking? We ought to be getting drunk if we're going to be around, for 12 years. And that's what I tell the students is, hey, if you really believe that, you need to drop out right now. You could go out and have a good time and for the next 10 years before and I assume if 12 years is the end of things, it'll get really bad in 4 or 5. So you might as well go out and party. And they all like that. It's like, hell, this guy actually, and it's just like, hey, think about it, guys. And it's, anyway, it's fun.
I definitely get your point. I think, when you look at some of these things, it's like, there's so many studies that are going on. There's so much that's out there. It's hard to be able to discern from what's actuality and what's just kind of, fudged numbers per se. But it's one of those things, if you look at it, it's like, I think it was one poster or something I read. It was like the glaciers have been melting longer than SUVs have been around.
Yeah.
So it's like, if you just kind of look at it at that point, because everybody's like, oh, the ice is melting. It's like, well, it's been melting for a very long time. Like, what? Like did we accelerate? Like, that's just a whole other conversation. It's like you can't look at it as just, because this is if it is the problem it is, it's a much larger problem than like the little slice of time period that we've been alive in the whole grand scheme of things. And so you can't,
right,
just look at one instantaneous point, right, and then say, okay, this is how we're going to make all of our decisions. It's kind of like, I was late to work. That doesn't mean I'm a bad employee forever. Just means I'm late to work one time. So
yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, the neat thing is, when I started teaching 33 years ago, is all this geological stuff, all this, knowing the history of mankind, the Neanderthals, when they lived, all the genetics and stuff they're able to do now. None of that was available. And now I could go back. And I'm an engineer, and I know you have an engineering or technical background, and being a lawyer too, and having a finance degree too. It's one of those deals that historically, all that information was not out there. But now I can go back and actually, and people like Gregory Wrightstone could go and get on, and we could show people using scientific methods, how much cooler, how much warmer it was, how much wetter it was, how much drier it was, and explain, why do we have these coal beds in Oklahoma? Why do they have these coal beds in Wyoming? Why is the Permian where the Permian is? Why is the Niobrara where it's at? And what were the conditions there? And they're like, wow, this is really cool stuff. And so to explain that scientifically, and I guess going back to global warming too, the other interesting thing is I've done a lot of environmental work as an environmental professor and just in litigation. And, they have these special models in these areas that are non-attainment, because non-attainment for ozone and particulate matter. And they have these special models the government makes you run to see what controls they're going to have to put on to clean up the air. And those models, regardless of, and they've been doing these models now for 25 or 30 years, the models are never accurate, because you'll put on the controls, like you put on the emission controls, the testing. And yeah, you're in Houston, you have to probably have your car tested. Houston's non-attainment also, in Houston, Port Arthur. And, part of the problem is it's a growing area, but they put those controls on. They've changed the formulations of our paints. When I moved here 30 years ago, the paints that I could use on my house for one thing, and now it's like totally different, which is good because it reduces the VOCs, but the air quality has not improved. And I just tell the students, if those models can't predict on a short-term basis, I guarantee you these long-term models, we are not going to be 20 degrees warmer in 10 years than we are now based on these models. I mean, we might, but it's going to be just a chance of luck. It's not going to be because the model has any predictive nature. And the people, unfortunately, that are in politics that are pushing all this, a lot of them do not have a real deep understanding of science. And I know, well, I won't say I know, but I tend to think, they're being taken advantage of by certain people who are pushing their agendas. And for better or worse, I mean, it's natural gas is a good agenda to push, I guess. And, keep the coal in the ground, I guess, should be my motto, because we don't have any coal mines. Well, we don't have hardly any coal mines left in Texas and Oklahoma versus back in the old days when they were digging coal mines left and right, in Oklahoma and in Texas. So, but anyway, unfortunately, because of the uncertainty with the science, you can regulate and impose a whole bunch of costs on society. And I tell you who pointed this out to me, and I had not thought about this, but the guy who wrote The Moral Case for Fossil Fuel, Alex Epstein, he Skyped into my class, and he did it. He was nice enough to do it, because I asked him, I go, Alex, I've been following you for years. We actually had you come in to SMU, and would you Skype in for an hour and just talk to the students? Because I'd explained to them what I just explained to you, as our students are really skeptical. And what he pointed out is the people who are imposing all these restrictions on energy that's making everything more costly, they're harming the people. They hurt the worst are the poor and the powerless, because you and I can afford an extra $100 a month for energy. But when you're on the street, trying to make a living and you're having trouble paying the rent, when the electric bill goes up by $20 a year, I mean, you may or may not be able to pay it. So those are the people that are getting hurt. So all these environmentalists who are trying to mandate stuff are really hurting the poor the worst. So are you still there? I see you're.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I'm still here. I'm still listening.
I can tell you, like David, it's like you got me. If you gave me a beer, the students say, "Man, if you ever get Dancy in a bar and give them a few beers, I mean, I'll give them a 5-hour monologue and about anything, global climate change, pollution, ozone, how to make us killing, what to do as a, as a lawyer. I'll give you, whatever. It's fun." So.
Well, let me ask you a couple of questions, as far as, because I know a lot of the viewers that we get on the VDoor Locksmith show are guys that are in the oilfield service business. Last week we had Fred Dupriest on, so we were able to get a lot of operators and drilling engineers, people in that regard, onto the show. So one of the questions I had for you was, I know that you've obviously done very well with the financial and looking over funds and stuff. Are these oil and gas companies right now, are they making money?
Well, good question. I mean, that's the big, you hear all the argument, what's your break-even price? Is it 50? Is it 60? Is it 70? And it really depends on the costs that you include in that area, as far as figuring out per barrel of reserve. And as you know, until you produce the stuff, it's all speculative. Whether so you say, "Oh yeah, we're getting $60 a barrel." Well, if you don't know, I mean, you could take your type curve and figure out what you're going to get or think you're going to get. And actually, I tell the students, I mean, that's the the whole concept, and I get a bunch of my undergraduate students, and actually my law students too, I tell them this, you drill a well, you know how much the well's going to cost you to drill and complete right up front. And you're going to, the decline curve roughly with a 95% confidence interval. So you can pretty much, if there's any other wells drilled out there, and normally, you drill after, another a dozen wells have been drilled. So you know the production because you have the decline curve and the completion technology. You know what's going to cost you because you can actually drill on a turnkey contract. And then you can actually lock in the prices based on the futures curve. Now, the futures curve is incredibly bad at forecasting what the future prices are going to be, but it's very good at, it's very good if you want your investors and bankers to know that, hey, I know I can sell this oil in 5 years for $55 a barrel. And so in reality, you could probably get more money. You could probably get better revenues by not hedging, but a lot of investors, a lot of banks, a lot of financiers, they want the whole package. And so you've essentially eliminated almost all the risk. You know your reserves, you drilled, you've held the lease, and you have a return based on the futures market. And the neat thing is, David, you can actually, as you know, I'm sure you know that you generally, the leases now, they have a clause in them that you hold from the surface down to the deepest depth drill. And so once you get, and if you have any uphole formations, you could figure those in the future. Of course, $1, in those shallower formations that you drill 5 or 10 years from now are heavily discounted because the value of money is such that something that you get 10 years from now, and actually talking to the executives, actually talking to the SEC has rules that for public companies, if you're not going to develop it within 5 years, it's worthless. But for private companies, as well as just hidden assets, there's as you know, in the Permian, for example, and again, I'm not a geologist or engineer, but they tell me, past the Wolf Camp, there are other formations that's a layer cake formations that are out there that are developable, but they'll be developable after 5 years and probably using technology that you and I can only dream about. So that's a long answer to tell you. From my standpoint, I think they could be profitable at $60 to $70 is what I've heard. At 50, 52 right now, I'd be very uncomfortable. I do think, and I will tell you, as an investor, I have probably more than half of my net worth tied up in 3 companies that are smaller companies that are operating in the Permian Basin and the Permian Basin only. Because I looked, North Dakota has some attractiveness, but the companies, I invest in smaller companies that are what we'd consider small cap or micro cap. And the larger companies, even Continental Resources, who's up in North Dakota, who's a great company, they're attractive, but they're not attractive. They're just too big for me. But Colorado, I would not touch. New Mexico, I'm concerned about because of the political situation in both those states. Oklahoma, the Scoop and Stack, I originally was very enthusiastic about. They still look good, but the Permian seems to be where everybody, you go in at our SMU, our student managed fund, you go talk to all the advisors, and the advisors on our managed fund, these dudes are really high-powered investors, and they all say, get out to the Permian Basin. For what it's worth, economically, you could probably, the Eagle Ford probably works, in Ohio, but someone said at $2.33 right now for natural gas, how the heck Ohio and Pennsylvania and West Virginia are going to work on the Marcellus and Utica when they aren't allowing you to build pipelines up there? Lord knows. I'm concerned about, I wouldn't touch natural gas at all. And I have a good friend that out of Houston, actually some of the investors, our listeners probably have heard, Dan Steffens of the Energy Prospectus Group. He has monthly luncheons down there, and he has a great newsletter. He has a portfolio of companies that he follows of 16. Well, he calls them the Sweet 16, the top, and 2 or 3 are natural gas companies, and he's continually telling me you need to look at natural gas. And that's like, hey, I'll stick with small oil companies in the Permian, and go from there. But anyway, that's a long answer. The natural gas companies are not making money. And of course, there's so much flaring now in the Permian Basin, but that's going to take care of itself within the next year, I think, with the build out, as well as the crude capacity issues in the Permian are going to take care of themselves. So I expect to see some more activity with regard to, because I tell you what, companies now, if you take their SEC proved reserves and you take their cash flow models and you run them backwards, I mean, they're selling for like oil at $45 or $40 a barrel. It's like, well, hell, I can buy these companies. I don't have to go drill. I could buy a company and give them a premium, for $45 or $50 a barrel and take them out. And, as long as there's some synergy there, and there's some companies out there that have a lot of capital, and there's a lot of money from New York that's running around out there, for better or for worse. There's a lot of New York money that doesn't have a clue what's going on. And I will tell you, since there is, I was not real active in the SMU investment fund, the student managed fund, in the last 6 months because I've been up in Oklahoma. But I was back there last week talking to them, and the students are really excited about, there is a service company out there. It's not we lost our shirt on the sand companies. The students all invested, and I won't mention the names, all the sand companies looked really attractive, and then we invested and then we lost our shirt and they got out of them. But the company that they think is attractive is Solaris, because Solaris is involved in the handling of the sand and some of the transport of the sand. And there's a couple other, and I'm not going to mention them because I can't remember if they're in the portfolio or not. They were a year ago, but the students dumped some stuff. And I will say this, at OU, I had the manager. There's a 100-year-old sand mine in southern Oklahoma, and it's owned by U.S. Silica, which is a U.S. Silica. At one time, the students thought that was a great company, and actually they were in our portfolio at one time. I don't know if they still are. But the manager down there, I said, gee, I'd love to have you come up, or I'd love to come down there and interview you and take some pictures and talk to our students about sand and Oklahoma sand. And he goes, well, Joe, I would rather present like this on Skype or Zoom in, because he goes, I really don't want a whole bunch of students stomping around a 100-year-old sand mine in the middle of eastern Oklahoma. And I said, that probably makes a lot of sense. But what he did say, he goes, the lucky for him with the scoop and stack, they're really busy. And number two, he goes, the size of the sand down there is really small. And he goes, when they first started fracking, they wanted larger size sand. So he goes, we were sort of bypassed for this Wisconsin sand. He goes, now as things has progressed, and you would know this, David, better than I, the smaller sand apparently they're using more and they're using smaller. And he goes, man, the market it's like a curveball that is come right into our sweet spot, and we're hitting it out of the park. And if you ever, hell, I've been driving back on I-35 between Dallas and Oklahoma City, and it's like every darn truck is a frac sand truck, and it's like I think there's about $1,000 or $2,000 worth of sand in each truck. I back calculated it out. They'll drive about 80 miles an hour. So the best thing, you stay about a half mile behind them because you don't want to get hit by a rock, although it's just sand anyway. But they drive 80, and you figure, hell, if anybody's going to get picked up, it's these dudes. And they get me halfway back to Dallas. So anyway, that's my long answer to your easy question.
Yeah, it's you could definitely find yourself behind one of them and end up getting the front of your car sandblasted. So one other question, I got to look over here at my notes real quick. So obviously, with it difficult for a lot of these operators to be able to make money, then that's going to just kind of flow downstream, obviously, with the service companies. So do you see this being a prolonged problem for the service companies going forward? If because if the service companies can't make good margins, then nobody's going to take that capital investment and that risk of creating a company, creating new products, doing R&D if they can't, if there's not going to be a return on investment. So do you see this problem with the oil and gas companies the way they are right now really affecting what could be possibly done in the future as far as the service companies? And if there is any, shining light in there for the service companies, what should they be focused on? Is it going to be more of being selective on who they work for, or some other mechanism making sure that they stay profitable?
Yeah, good question. Well, I know this week Baker Hughes, the rig count in the United States overall is down 7% from last year. So it's relatively stable, but when your rig count is going down, like that's quite a few wells. That's 70 wells at say 10 million each. When the rig count is even or declining, as a service company, you're not going to want to spend a whole bunch of money in latest technology. And I will say, it's been a year now since I've been out to the Permian Basin, but when I went out and I visited some operators that I've invested with, and we drove around, and one of their biggest comments, and actually I've heard this from Spears and Associates up in Tulsa also, is the frac crews, the lack of frac crews and the lack of frac equipment. And they've told me, what I've heard is, number one, you don't want to drill a good well, or you want to drill a 8,000-foot lateral and then have someone go in and mess up the completion. So getting a good frac crew is an issue. And they also said, historically, because of the cyclicality of the nature, a lot of the equipment has not been kept up. And so there's a real concern that as things turn around in the Permian Basin and elsewhere, but the Permian Basin is like, the reason I talk about it, it's like 50% of our drilling. So if you talk about the Permian Basin, and then you add, Oklahoma's another 10%. Well, actually, New Mexico's another 10%. So you take the 50% and add New Mexico, which is the Permian Basin, for you're talking 60 or 70% of the drilling. And they've told me that a lot of the companies have not, because like you say, the return on capital is not there. So why should you go out and rehab your 2,000 horsepower engine or your equipment? And so the number of companies out there with good, reliable, up-to-date, renovated equipment is relatively small. And there's a real concern now going forward, because what's going to happen in the Permian, they're going to start putting these pipelines. They're going to go, both the natural gas as well as the crude, as well as the liquids pipelines, are all going to go online. And so you have all these drilled and uncompleted wells out there, and every operator is going to call up and say, "Hey, come out and complete 10 of our wells." And the completion company, number one, they've been laying people off the last 6 months or 8 months. Number two, they don't have the equipment. Number three, water is always an issue out there. So it'll be interesting to see how the completion market goes. Now, sand, the only thing I know about sand, again, as a service company, is as investors, we thought, and this is not only the students thought it was a great idea, our investment advisory board, I won't tell you who's on our investment advisory, but these are like hotshot vice presidents of finance, these companies, these banks, these lenders, and they personally jumped in left and right. I personally think were coming up to me and say, "Hey, when the students decide what sand company to pick, send me an email, because I want to front run them before because the students are willing to buy like $3,000 worth of stock, and of course some of these VPs are, they're going to load up a couple $100,000 of it before they, load up their, balance their portfolio." But we lost our shirt on sand, and what I've read is that a lot of companies now are using local sand versus Wisconsin sand. And I tell you, that raises some really interesting legal issues that I brought up a year ago. People thought I was nuts. One of my students wrote an article on it, and here's what the legal issue is, David. Actually, the issue for service companies is, if you use Wisconsin sand, the decline curve is going to be, you're going to get more oil out of that well than if you use Texas sand or Oklahoma sand. It's just, the engineers tell me that. Wow. And actually they tell me, a couple of the engineers have told me they call it Texas dirt, because we could, or we could use Wisconsin white, I think. Wisconsin white. And of course I tell them, God, it sounds like it's marijuana, man. But you give me some Wisconsin white and, Texas dirt. And the implication is that Well, number one, if you're going to sell that well and you take the decline curve, the first 6 months of the year, you can't tell how much more the Texas dirt well is going to decline from the Wisconsin white. And so you can actually sell the well and actually sort of overstate what you think the reserves are going to be to the buyer, which, has brought up issues. This is from consultants have told me this. Now, this is not my theory. This is what have heard from experts who come into my class. And they said, essentially, you could almost make an argument, that it's almost fraud, but it's really not, because you're not under a duty to disclose what type of frac sand you use. I've talked to some publicly about this, and a couple mineral owners have come up afterwards and said, can you go to the Railroad Commission or Oklahoma Corporation Commission and figure out? No, they're under no duty to tell you whether they're using what sand they're using. It's just like it's secret. It's all the chemicals you use, the sand you use, the pressures, it's all secret. And so what they use, but they're the question I had, as an operator, do you have a duty to use the higher quality sand for the mineral owner? Because the mineral owner isn't paying the cost. So do you have to, should you use the Cadillac? Of course, I'm sort of dating myself using Cadillac. It's like, youngsters today, well, should we use the Ferrari or should we use, the broken down Chevrolet, into the well? Because it's going to be a lot more expensive to put in the good stuff. And my answer is, as long as the operator is prudent, I think they can use the Texas sand, even though it's not as effective as the Wisconsin sand, even though it's much more expensive and you'll recover more. But there's also policy issues. And I've talked to the Railroad Commission about this. I know some people down there pretty well and said, from a policy issue, it should be the goal of the state, especially on state lands, to get all the oil and gas out that we can and hopefully not flare it.
That's true.
And so, maybe we ought to say, have them indicate what type of sand they use. But of course, and again, this is all hearsay. I'm sure there's some Texas sand that probably, but I've been told the reason the Wisconsin sand is so good is because it's round, it's really strong, and when you stick it a mile underground, and this, and I, as a lawyer, I didn't think about it. I mean, you got a mile worth of dirt on top of you, and if your sand is not like a marble, it will crush real easy. And that's what happens to Texas and Oklahoma dirt, or frac sand, I should say. And actually, even North Dakota, the Geological Society up there is looking at, the state is looking for local sources of frac sand up there. And the state has come to the conclusion, at least the state geologist, there was an article in one of the papers up there in the Bakken Business Journal or whatever, that everything the geologist looked at, the state geologist, he goes, North Dakota might have oil, but the sand is not worth using in fracking operations from the test. And I don't know, I'm sure there's tests that they run on this frac sand. So
it's almost like you start looking at these operators as financial advisors. Like, do they have a fiduciary duty to do what's best for you? Because, whether you're a mineral rights owner, you're a like landowner, like you own the mineral rights there, and and that you're allowing them to come out and drill on your land. Or, right. If you are a partial investor in the well or the drilling package as a whole, right. And then you, like you brought up there, the possibility that if I come in afterwards, you drill the well, then I come in afterwards to be able to purchase that well. Is that considered a part of the well's asset? Like we talk about in the drilling side, when you take surveys and where the well bore's placed. Right. That is an asset to the well because it is the digital record right. of where the well bore is placed, so that is part of it, right? So now you could also say, hey, how you did your completions, what you put down hole, all of these other things, they are part of what I'm purchasing. I want to know what's because essentially you're buying that sand.
Right. You can ask them, and they can either tell you no, they don't have a duty to disclose, but if they're selling it, probably. The other thing you got to think about, and this too, you drill the parent well, the first well, and then you figure, well, I have 4 more locations, so I take the parent well times 4. So there is a incentive for the operator to use the best sand and the best completion techniques, because then when they get the decline curve, they can say, this is what the decline curve looks like. Unfortunately, And we had this at the AADE student seminar. We had a couple Society of Petroleum Engineer people come in, and they've done a study where generally the parent well is usually one of the best wells, and the child well, generally their decline curve gives you much less reserve. So if you go in and if you're going to sell me a well, and I look at the well that you drilled, and then I figured, well, I got 8 more locations, and figured, well, I'll get a return on times 8. That's not the case. And actually, this was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. It was unfortunate because I put a post on. I summarized the post and paper on LinkedIn, and of course I have all these followers that thought it was great, including some people from the Wall Street Journal, and they actually called me up and talked to me for a half hour about the parent-child issue, and then I gave them references, and they called those people up, and then they wrote the article was on the front page, and I looked to see if I was mentioned. No mention. I was like, it's not bad. I'm glad to be a reference, and it was a paper, and actually the people they used were like chief executive officers of some very large drillers, but it is sort of cool when they put the feather on their hat, and it's like at least they say, so and so, because that's where they sort of peg the issue from. So the child issue, that's another. That is the parent-child issue is another issue that comes up that creates problems when you're selling. So and a number of people, at least in the Permian I've talked to, they say some of these New York folks are just going to be so shocked when they go out and buy, they get one well and buy based on 8 more wells, and their investor is going to take a bath. But he goes, the promoter may or may not have any skin in the game. So they don't have any skin in the game. It's like, well, yeah, bad luck, guys, but that is a risk, and it's a quantifiable risk. But all this stuff is so cool because whether you have law students, whether you have business students, whether you have engineering students, all this stuff comes into play, and it's all technology. And who would have believed, David, 15 years ago, we put a mile-long train car with a sand into one well. It's like back in the day, it was like you have 3 hopper cars full of sand, and that was a big load. And of course, you're just loading in a vertical, 20 feet of vertical or whatever. And now you're going, 2 or 3 miles, and you're loading in a whole long train car versus, and then you're debating what quality of sand to use, and then of course. We haven't even talked about water, which is another huge issue. But and actually, I think you mentioned before, and if you haven't, I guess just on the survey of the well on the well board, there's a big issue with regard to when you inject all this sand and stuff and water. What happens if it goes across the property line? Is it still yours? Do you lose it? Is it trespass? There's a bunch of lawyers who have and geologists and engineers have just gone wild. And I tell you, when I first got aware of this about 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I'm on the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. It's a regulatory body that's representing Texas. I was appointed by Governor Nye back in the day, and George Bush appointed me, and I'm still on it. But what they were telling me in North Dakota, when they first started doing some of those wells, Harold Hamm would drill a well, and then they'd shut in the well next to it. They said, okay, we're going to frack it, shut in your wells because they don't want to damage it. And you'd frack the well, then you'd turn your well back on, and it would immediately, you'd have 15 or 20% more production because the frack is forcing oil. Well, it's making those cracks, but it's also forcing oil into the joining. And of course, the big issue goes is, number one is a trespass. And of course, up in North Dakota, if you're turning the well on and it works 20% better, it's like you're not going to complain. It's like, dudes, you need to do some more fracking over there so I can well flowing. But on the other hand, in some states, when that happens, when you actually can, it's called frack bashing the decline curve. You can actually frack. They'll turn their well on, and it'll be 90% of what it was, or 80%, or it'll be a vertical well that'll be totally flushed out. Then the question is there liability? Has there been a trespass? And the courts generally have argued, and I've worked with a number of people on this. Generally, it's being looked at now by the courts, but the general rule is if you shoot water underground or if you shoot sand and it goes across your lease line, that's not a trespass. That's the rule of capture. So if you shoot it across the lease line and you get the oil back, that goes across. It's the way it's always been for the last 150 years. And if your sand goes across somewhere, now it's different than if I if I took the well and actually took it across the lease line, if I physically go across,
Yeah.
trespass.
Tell me about that. Tell me about that. What happens if because this is definitely my area of, I don't want to call it expertise, but this is the area that I do a lot of work in. I'm by no means an expert in my industry, but let's say that, for whatever reason, a wellbore does, not just cross the lease line, but cross the hard line. So we're actually going over into someone else's, or hard line into lease line, go past somebody else's, into somebody else's domain, let's call it. And then they do produce. Now, obviously, for something like that to happen now, a lot of things would have to go wrong. Right? I think there's a lot of safeguards in place. But if something were to like that happen, or if they just went back and looked at some older wells where, some of the safeguards that we have in place right now, because like right now we've got companies that do survey correction. They're looking at these things in real time, making sure, and just doing, insane mathematical models to be able to increase the accuracy, or at least understand the where that wellbore is located at better than what it used to be. So with some of these things, like let's say that well does go awry and end up someone else's place, and then it gets caught after the fact. What would be, like, is this an SEC issue if there's publicly traded companies involved? Is this a regulatory thing with, because obviously all the surveys have to be turned into the railroad commissions, Texas Railroad Commission, or all 50 different ones here in the States. How does that transpire, as far as regulators, courtroom, compliance stuff?
Right, it's interesting. Actually, let me tell you, there's an interesting story on just deviated wells across lease lines. This is in East Texas, the East Texas oil field where the Hunts made their fortune and the Murchises and the Basses. What happened is the Dancy Bradford number 3 well was drilled right, literally within 100 yards of the end of that field. And so what happened in a lot of those wells down in Kilgore, if you got a well in the field, that's great. But then they figured out where the formation, the woodbine watered out. And what they could do is you drill a well, and then you've condemned the lease. And so after the lease is condemned, you can approach the mineral owner, and the farmer's all bummed out. It's like, God, well, gee, I can drill a well, and I want to lease your land, but I'm not going to pay you the going rate. I'll pay you like cents on the dollar for that mineral right. And what they did, this is back in the 30s. You couldn't do this now, but about 10 or 15% of the wells on the eastern portion of the East Texas oil field is the largest conventional field in the United States. About 15% of them, they would drill down and deviate and go sideways and drill into your neighbors. And of course, it's like the middle owner isn't going to say anything because he probably wonders, well, God, they just drilled, they drilled a well, it was dry, but now this operator comes in and he drills it, it's a great well, and he's not going to argue, he's getting royalty. And of course, the operator, of course, back in the time, you didn't have the downhole surveys. Now you have to do downhole surveys, you have to turn them in, there's penalties, etc. And apparently, I've seen just the historical books, it's sort of interesting that, there were a lot of people who were drilling across lease lines, which is a clear intentional trespass, and apparently some of the names that were very high-level politicians and in Texas and oil people too that would are very well known. Which the oil people, I guess neither one surprises me now that I say that. Anyway, today, here's a basic rule: if you accidentally trespass, if I go on your property and I have a lease and I think you gave me a lease and I think you have title and I drill it and it is a really good well. The rule is, if it's good faith, I get my money back. The $5 million it cost me the well, I get my money back. I get the operating cut. But once the well pays out, I turn the keys over to you. So it's like, and the way the court, the reason they thought about that is because, if I'm in good faith, I've taken all the risk, but once I got my money back, but I shouldn't be penalized because I was in good faith, because I really thought, now if I knew you were giving me a lease that was no good and was owned by someone else, that was owned, like, say, your wife, and your wife didn't want to lease to me, But I said, okay, and I drill on your land, and it's in bad faith because I know you don't have title. But I figure, well, I can waive this lease out here, and I can say, I'm in good faith, but if I'm in bad faith, what the courts generally say is like, well, dude, you essentially just hand the keys to you, but I don't get the drilling costs back. I don't get my operating costs back. I have to account for you if I took any of the proceeds. And actually, there's been cases like this. Well, there's been cases like this in a number of jurisdictions historically, and so that's why before you drill, you get a title attorney and a good landman to run the title, to do the requirements. I would say do the requirements, to meet the requirements and make sure title's good, because you don't want to put your title at risk. And there's actually people out there, landmen and attorneys, that when a good well comes in, if title is difficult, they'll go back in and check the record to make sure the people that should have leased have leased. And of course, in Oklahoma, what you can do, you can force pool people, which just means force them to give you a lease. In Texas, you're limited. Your forced pooling opportunities are limited. You have to gerrymander and make different deals. And in Texas, I tell my students, if you want to be a landman, you need to be a landman in Texas, because the deals you make there are much more. The way the legal system's set up and the land system set up, you're doing more deals up there. In Oklahoma, if you're a landman and the mineral owner doesn't want to lease to you, generally they just, well, I'll take you to the corporation commission, and the agency will make you give a lease. And when I was up in Oklahoma years ago, when I got out of practice, that's what I did. I did spacing, increased density, pooling. We made people, gave leases. We get a landman up there, and I'll tell you an interesting story. You have to have a landman testify as to the values of it. And I was representing a mineral owner, and the company was force pooling them, and we didn't want to be force pooled. And he was testifying, and at the end of the application, there's a list of people you can't find. There's a whole bunch of people in Oklahoma you can't find, because over the years, there's like, your interest gets smaller and smaller. Half of them have moved to California during the Dust Bowl. But on the back page of one of the people this landman could not find, and this was like in the late 1980s when I had this hearing, one of them was Barry Switzer. And of course, I pulled it out and said, I understand your testimony with regard to the land values. That's very incredible. We just was curious, back here on page 13, Exhibit B, of all these people that you can't find. Now, you did a good look. Oh, I couldn't find them. You looked everywhere. I couldn't find them. And this is the time, Barry was like coach at the time. It's like I showed it to him. The hearing officer, his face got totally red, slammed down his pen. He looked at the landman, and he said, I tell you what, he goes, I'm going to continue this for 3 weeks. I want you to look at all these people on this last page, and if you can't find Barry Switzer, don't bother coming back in this courtroom. I was like, and my client was so happy. Of course, in the end, we got force pooled anyway. So it's like, we had a good time though. So that's fun.
That's interesting. He's like, oh, you can't find the guy that's on TV right now. He's right there. Of course, David, I totally understand why the landman, because Barry, you don't want people showing up at your house. You don't want people calling you. So I'm sure he had an unlisted number. I'm sure, although everybody in Norman knows where he lives, or at least they do now. Back then, I'm sure everybody knew where he lived, so he could go down and have a drink at a bar, and they tell him, oh yeah, he's down on wherever. Or you just, or actually, the hearing officer suggested, he goes, if you can't find him, I would, you ought to go over to the athletic department down to OU and just hang out for a while. And that was the best comment. Anyway, it's exciting. Well, and so we've talked a little bit about, as far as the issues there. What are some of the things that are like, because you said you went to the most recent OGCC, oil and gas.
IOGCC. It's
IOGCC.
Yeah, Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission. It used to be the Interstate Oil Commission. It was set up by Governor Marland of Oklahoma in the 1930s. Most people don't know. He was out of Ponca City. He went up and this week, next week, it'll be the anniversary of his first big discovery well. It was the Willie Cries #1 well. It's on the Ponca Reservation. I went out there about 6 months ago. It's on a site. Unfortunately, it's very interesting now. There's a whole bunch of oil wells still out there, but now it's in the middle of a wind turbine field. So you have all these wind turbines as well as oil wells. And I took a picture. It's actually the field now is operated. At the time was called the 40 Sands Field. The field now is operated by a major operator, and I can't remember who they are. If I did, I wouldn't say it. But anyway, and of course, Marlin actually was forced to sell to by the bankers to Conoco, Continental Oil, which became Conoco. So today, Conoco is actually Marlin Oil, and he was one of the richest guys on the planet. Marlin owned 10% of the world oil reserves back in 1928, and he built this mansion out there. He was like Saudi Arabia, but then the bankers forced him out, and he essentially had to go through reorganization. Personally, he pretty much lost and made a couple fortunes and ended up pretty much penniless, or relatively penniless. I mean, he was compared to being one of the richest guys in the world. But anyway, it's a long story. Then he became governor. He figures, well, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to become governor, which is a state governor. You really can't do too much with the bankers. But he set up this organization, and what they do is they meet every 6 months. They're the regulators. The Railroad Commission was there, Corporation Commission, Kansas Commission, and the academia is there, but there's only like 2 academias left, me and Bill Keffer out of Texas Tech. So we have, the stunning thing is, it's like, you would think a lot of these universities would have an interest in participating, but it's like, well, no, oil and gas is not something that should be taught. It's like, and here it's like, Bill Keffer and I are the regulators. Actually, the regulators have pointed this out. It's concerning to them how adverse the public and the youngsters, their viewpoint with regard to the industry. Because as the regulators, it creates all sorts of grief when you have a public that is hostile. And actually, let me give you, and I won't tell you what state it is. It's not Texas and it's not Oklahoma, but there is a state that does have, it's in the middle of the country, that has had some real interesting problems with environmentalists. They've had a whole bunch of Californians with these environmental groups try to enter into these cases that deal with oil and gas development. They have no interest. They're not investors. They're not, they don't own minerals. They don't own surface. They don't have economic interest. But they figure if they could go in and protest these cases, they do it online, they could protest these cases. And what is done, it is just log jammed the entire, docket. So you can't, as a state regulatory agency, they haven't been able to approve the drilling permits and the unitization permits because of, and it runs the cost. So you start doing this, it delays, your time value of money. You get a bunch of attorneys out there, you run up the cost. And of course, these environmental organizations, they're all foundations. So essentially, they have unlimited funds from some, rich dudes that, save planet, we're stopping global warming. So what the state has done, they adopted about a year ago, because there is an issue, a legal issue, that if I go and I'm going to impact your property, you have notice and you should be able to talk about it. And so it's called standing. So what the state agency said is, unless you have standing, which means you either are a mineral owner, a surface owner, an investor, or some other connection, we're not going to allow you to stop these hearings. And apparently that has worked really well. And these agents, they haven't been challenged, but it's very clever. I wouldn't say clever, but it's an interesting ploy. And the same way with pipelines. I mean, if you can take a pipeline, and then you don't, as you've seen the last couple of years, it's like I can go protest the pipeline, and if I can stop them in a court, number one, I have a bunch of construction equipment. I have a bunch of guys that make a bunch of money that are sitting at the hotel doing nothing. I can, your costs are going through the roof. The courts, issues an injunction, which makes it, even if you get approval, it makes the economics so much worse. And so that's a big battlefield. And I shouldn't say, I understand the environmentalists. I understand their concerns, but I just, I firmly believe global warming is an issue, but it's not an issue. It's not. It'll actually, in the end, David, global warming is going to prove more beneficial than it will be harmful over the next 50 to 100 years. That's my take. And if that's your take, it's like, well, why the heck, are we stopping oil pipelines? We're shipping it, versus railroad tank cars. This makes no sense because they're dangerous as heck. And when they blow up, they're like bombs. Or, we're shutting it in, or, we're importing oil, or we're not exporting oil that, is a natural resource that is going to help our economy and employ people, employ the kids of this country, the engineers, the scientists. And it's hard to believe. But anyway, that was one of their concerns, and it has been a concern. And going forward, and actually this fall and this spring at Oklahoma City University School of Law, my wife and I are going to sponsor a number of speakers from industry to come in. And I talked to the dean there, and what the dean said was, and I think it's popped up here, I don't know, what I told the dean is, I'm really concerned, could we have people from industry? And Jim Roth is the dean at Oklahoma City University. He is an energy guy. He used to be Oklahoma Corporation Commissioner. He is, I will say, he's a wind power guy, but he admits, he goes, oh, Joe, I understand. He goes, when he was involved in like 75% of all the wind power in Oklahoma, and he goes, Oklahoma's the number 2. And he goes, when it's so concentrated, he goes, oil and gas, he goes, there's thousands of people involved in oil and gas, and thousands of attorneys, thousands of landmen, thousands of engineers. The mineral owners get, thousands of people. And he goes, we really need, because it really is not being done at any of the other schools to approach the students, especially these are the brightest of the bright that are getting an advanced degree, the law students. And Lord knows, some of them may become politicians or regulators. True. If you can educate them. And that's what at University of Oklahoma, I had a number of people from the Corporation Commission and the Environmental Commission in my class, and they were like, man, we've never heard this side of the story, how beneficial oil is, and it's like, well, dude, look around. It's like, clearly, you have, I forget the statistics are like, half of all the jobs in Oklahoma are oil or gas or energy or pipeline or processing, and the mineral owners are making a killing. The other interesting thing is, again, we have the people come in, the anti-global warming. They said, well, you need to shut down not only oil and gas, but you need to shut down agriculture because of the methane emissions. Yeah. It's like, dudes, do you know what'll be left in Oklahoma? You get rid of oil, you get rid of agriculture. There'll just be a bunch of people at Starbucks, and they'll be sitting around, contemplating the latest novel that's been written or something. It's anyway, that's my take, but it is a concern of the regulators. The other interesting thing, just for $1 billion in it, there is a bunch of wells in Ohio that, Ohio was drilled starting like 1860. A lot of those early wells, you could just imagine. They weren't cased, or they were cased and it's all gone now. They weren't well located. So what the Ohio regulators are doing, they're taking a drone. This is a side story, a drone with a magnetometer, and they're finding these, and then they're putting them out to bid. And what the Ohio regulators said, and actually they told me and a couple other engineers there, he goes, Joe, if you want to go in business, he goes, we can't get people to bid on, we can't find crews to plug. And of course, he goes, and I go, are most of them easy? He goes, well, they're well plugging, depends on the wells, whether they're easy or not. But we put them in packages, and we try to give, 2 easy wells with, every, hard well. And so, but he goes, if you got a plugging crew in Ohio and, you're aware of the bidding process, you could keep your, we have wells, we could give as much work as you can plug, quite frankly. And apparently the plugging packages, I think he told me, come in like, 10 to 20 at a time. And so, because I asked him, I go, hell yeah, I just don't want to go plug one well. And I go, because you have to set up a company, you have to get the people, you have to get the equipment, you have to get certified. And he goes, well, they come 10, and he goes, we have 40. And the neat thing is, legislatively, they can't use the money for anything else. It's been earmarked. The smart thing was, the Ohio legislature was concerned, or the parties who, was concerned that, the schools or whatever would suck the money out. So they said, you can only use this for plugging and remediation. And actually they had some really cool slides. And actually I wrote an article in the Bakken Oil Journal and included some of those slides. It was just been published online of farm fields. And it looks like a little red dot in the middle of, there'll be 5 or 6 of them. You look on the surface, David, it looks like a farm field. But when you But they said if you actually go out there in the farm field, and the reason they knew there was a problem is the farmer said, hey, I got there and plow and I can smell the oil and gas. And so when you do you can actually, then what they do is they go on the ground with a handheld magnetometer, and they go, generally the drone will get us within 10 feet. He goes, and he goes, a lot of times, and actually they showed a picture of this, they go, we drilled, a lot of times it's cut off like 2 or 3 feet under the surface. And he goes, a couple times we found like cannonballs that were, put on top of the pipe to keep it plugged. And that's how they plug it. It's like, we pulled off the cannonball and it was open. And it was like, anyway, it's a very interesting, but they said literally, Joe, you can make a good, if you know any people in Ohio that want to plug wells, they have a severe problem, and I will give you the regulators. We just approached the Ohio oil and gas regulators, and actually, if you use my name, they all know me now. So it's I've dealt with them over the last 5 or 10 years, and we've become pretty good friends. And they're a very progressive state regulatory wise. They're reasonable, but they're not excessive as far as what they require of industry. So you have to appreciate that, because they realize how important oil and gas is, especially with Marcellus and Utica. It was a gift to them a few years ago. It's like, hell, we never thought, there's going to be a drilling rush back in Ohio, versus 1860s and 1870s when, now and they had it. And of course, Chesapeake was in there, and all these other companies. I don't know Chesapeake. I know, the Oklahoma City group. I can't remember of. Anyway, it's one of it's a private. Ascent Resources is big in Ohio. And I know that actually the general counsel for Ascent was one of my first law students back in the 80s, and he's a guy I met him, and he goes, I'm general counsel of Ascent, and I was like, man, I should have stuck on his coattails versus him taking my class. This is back in the 80s when I first started teaching. So it is interesting. I have a number of my students that become general counsel and have become big dogs, and a lot of them aren't practicing law. They go into something else, but a lot of them are, and it's good to it's interesting to see, because they remember you, and for the most part, I remember them, and for the most part, they've done pretty well. At least the people that I've kept in contact, so that's good.
Well, there's a couple of things I want to reflect on that you were talking about earlier. So one thing with a lot of the push about, how bad oil and gas is and things of that nature. Last week we had Fred Dupriest on the show, and I was able to ask him a little bit about geothermal drilling and what of the technology that we have in the drilling space would actually translate over to geothermal. And he says it's a 1-to-1. So one of the things I look at is that if it's a conversation I've had with several people that are, because I live in a very liberal area in Austin, just outside of Austin, is that, okay, if you snap your fingers and all of a sudden either oil and gas drilling is illegal, right? And or like all the oil in the world just disappears, it wasn't there anymore, right? I was like, if we took the industry as it is, I was like, all of those drilling rigs are still going to be busy. I was like, but are they going to be busy here in the U.S. or are they going to be busy elsewhere? And the thing is a lot of oil and gas technology, a lot of the independent stuff is developed either here in the U.S. or you've also got Calgary, where there's a good hotbed, and in Oslo, Norway, or like the 3 spots where you always see like new drilling technology come up. And so I tell people, I was like, look, like drilling rigs out on the horizon is not going away. It's just not going to happen. I was like, whether you do it through snapping your fingers and magic, or if it happens because of like legal legislation, a political party who says that we're not allowed to do this anymore. I was like, all those drilling rigs are just going to go right to geothermal drilling. And they can either be here in the U.S. doing it as we continue to develop and invest in the companies that are developing these technologies and allowing us that opportunity, or they can go to other places where it's more financially, the financial economics works out better because they're shallower, they're a little bit better, and it'll be more of like Pacific Rim. Some companies like that are working on this stuff are looking at places like in the Philippines or in Iceland or
Right.
Southeast Asia to be able to go drill a lot of these wells. So it's just one of those things that I like to tell people is like, drilling's not like, you're not going to stop that. You might, and even with fracking, there might be fracking technology that ports over to the whole action of being able to produce some of these geothermal wells. So it's really interesting how many people are just like, they're just against something just to be against it, and then they just look at it and say, oh, it's bad, all of it's bad. And it's like, no, not really. And if anything, like, all of the money that goes into drilling is actually helping us get to a point where, you know, we could potentially move that direction. But as for right now, it's going to be what economically makes money and helps out, you know, the people in that area, especially like you said with Oklahoma, with the number of people that are, I don't want to say dependent, but are encouraged to be able to work in the oil and gas business. So.
Exactly. And that's the other thing you point out. It's sort of a side issue is the United States is really unique in that private people own minerals in the United States. Almost every other country on earth does not. And people don't realize in Colorado, if you stop drilling, you are messing with people's vested rights. It's like I came and put a outhouse in your front yard. I can't do that because you have a vested property right. You can let me, but if the mineral rights are the same way. The mineral rights are vested rights, and if you stop people from allowing them, you're taking bonus payments from them. You're taking royalty payments from them. You are actually stealing, and there's constitutional protections from that. And I tell my students, and when I get journalists who, oh, gee, we really need to ban fracking, and I said, well, just be aware that if you ban fracking, you are going to have to pay for those minerals because somebody owns them, and it's going to be billions of dollars. And the government, I mean, they can't.
Denton, Texas.
Yeah. I mean, you can reasonably restrict those, and the question is what's reasonable and what's not is another issue. But that is one area. I mean, at Oklahoma City University at the law school, when I work with them, I actually would love to set up a policy institute there because at University of Oklahoma, I think we had an energy center. They shut it down like a week before Christmas on me and said, we really don't. Their concern is look at these issues dealing with regulations versus taking. And because Colorado, I guarantee you're going to see more in Colorado. You're going to see more in New Mexico. You're going to see more in California. I mean, the good news is, and when I invest, and the other thing of when I invest, whenever you see those issues like the Colorado issues, it's just a risk to investment. So why would you spend any money? As an investor, I don't care what you have in Colorado. I won't invest there because it is a state where they're asking to steal your property. So what I do, I'll go to North Dakota because they're reasonable. I'll go to Oklahoma. I'll go to Texas. I'll go to Louisiana, Arkansas. They all regulate, but they aren't going to, they aren't wanting to stop drilling because they realize how important it is and what the economic value is there. But it is, and it's interesting. And again, that Dan Steffens, who's he runs the Energy Prospectus Group out of Houston. Some of his favorite companies, one or two of them, have Colorado plays. And I look at his cash flow models, and I look at the engineering models, and I look at the company reports, and man, they really look attractive. But they look attractive if they were in the Permian Basin, or if they're in Oklahoma City, or in Kansas, or in North Dakota, because I realized, the number of infill wells. If you can't drill infill wells, and you expect in your model that you're going to drill 10 of them, but you can only drill 3 because of restrictions. Well, your model, the value, you shot yourself in the foot. So,
just think of on an extreme incident of Venezuela. There is tons to drill there. There's tons that could be invested there, but everybody is so scared that if you're a service company, if you're an operator or anything, you go down there and you put in the work, you put in the time, and all of a sudden, government snatches all of it up. So it's going to be one of those things. But,
those are your words, not mine.
But if you look at it on a smaller scale, it's like, when politics start getting involved and impeding the ability to be able to move forward with projects and incurring uncertainty of risk, then yeah, you've got to be able to pull your money back.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, the other point I was going to make on your, a lot of people have told me, gee, if we look at hydrothermal, what did you call the drilling for? Is it hydrothermal? Geothermal. Yeah. Well, I tell you what, I've heard that, and then I started doing some research because they've told me, and actually this is sort of a sad state of affairs, but they said, gee, I don't have my energy law course, because I had 70 students in there. The limit of the room is 75. So my classes are packed. They're the biggest. But they said, if you want to totally sell it out, you can, if you had a class on just renewables, wind, solar, and geothermal. And I'm doing the research, there are positives and there are negatives with all of them. A lot of them are tax driven. A lot of them are incentive driven. They're all going to the electric system, the utilities. I've talked to the coal-fired plant dudes, and they say when these, everything's jumping in and out of your system, it creates stability issues as well as this potential for hacking. If you have like 5 different wind plants, shooting in, and it's all electronically controlled, you have issues. But from a geothermal standpoint, and there is major issues with induced seismic. And in Oklahoma, and the reason I just came up is Oklahoma has had major issues with induced seismic. They pretty much, and actually that was part of the regulators meeting. A number of induced seismic events have declined, and I can't off the top of my head, it's declined by 75% in the last 5 years. And and that's like events above like magnitude, I think 2.7. So you can actually, those are the ones you can feel. And that's because they reduced the water volumes and the water pressures. But they said with the geothermal, what it is you're moving water and you're extracting heat, and you're moving water at pressure, and you're moving a lot of it. And they said there are a lot of examples, real life examples, where everybody thought this would be great, but they actually had to shut down or reduce the capacity of some of these geothermal because they started having local induced seismic events. So if you go to California, and they think they have, you have a bunch of fault zones, and then you induce seismic. I mean, and you have a major earthquake. You could actually blame it on, potentially a geothermal. In addition to that, because the water is hot, a lot of times it'll dissolve. As you know, you're a technical guy. It'll dissolve the surface guys. I mean, you get hot water, it'll dissolve a lot of stuff that cold water won't. So you got this hot water that's coming up, and it's usually highly mineralized, or can be. And you usually get sometimes you got vapors coming off it that are usually not all the healthiest. And so there are a lot of side impacts to clean geothermal that a lot of people have not thought about. Besides the fact that a lot of areas it's not really viable. I know
the thing is, like, here in the U.S., oil and gas drilling is viable.
Right.
But as Fred Dupree said last week, he was like, there's not very many places here in the U.S. that are viable for it. Like, it's just like, drilling in the Permian versus drilling in the Barnett right now or in the Haynesville.
Right.
Some of those spots are not viable with the price of, per barrel or for MCF, it's not viable. So if you start looking at the geothermal stuff, it's like, okay, where is viable? And it's not going to be as many places. That's right. What I was saying, though. It's just like you're still going to see all those rigs, but they're going to be somewhere else. But you can't right. Look at those rigs as being something bad. That could be an investment towards the future, right? As far as the technology that's needed to be able to make those other places economically viable. Right. So it's one of those things. It's like, well, let's take your argument and spin it all the way around. But I wouldn't be too sad if California had a whole bunch more seismic events and then floated off and a little bit further. So let me ask you this. We talked about a lot of different topics and stuff. What is it, though, that the regulators are looking at? Because I know that big data was one of the things that, because I read your article or whatever in the Bakken Oil Journal?
Bakken Oil Journal, yep.
So I read that article, and one of the things that you had mentioned in there was big data and stuff. What data is really important for the regulators to look at? So in your article, you had mentioned some stuff about Chevron and their safety, right? You saw obviously stuff in Ohio about plugging and abandoning wells. What else though? What kind of data are they wanting to capture? How granular are they looking to be able to get? Because as you know, part of Gibson Reports, what I do is I go out there and I look for all of the survey data for all the different states and stuff, and every one of them's different. What kind of granularity are they really looking for to be able to help them out, and what do they plan on doing with some of this data?
Yeah, good question. It's I do know. Well, there is an interesting issue with data, and actually the Ohio drone project that they have a magnetometer. They're also doing a elevation survey, and they could actually they're going to be able to go across the state of Ohio with their drone, and they'll be within a quarter inch, knowing they can see wagon wheels that were left there, in areas that haven't been, plowed up 150 years ago. And so the deal is, and I hadn't thought about this until I started. We actually have a drone project at the University of Oklahoma. We went out to the Discovery Well for the Permian Basin. But you capture a whole lot of data, and if you're a regulator flying over, you're going to capture a whole bunch of data that you can use. And again, the Ohio people are very reasonable, the regulators, with regard to their use of the data, because they realize, and they told me, Joe, we're finding a whole bunch of wells. We had no clue. We were going out looking for one, and we found three. I mean, that was their standard. And it makes, it's like in the 1860, you drill a well and just got the hell out of there if it didn't produce, or after it produced, you just left it there. But how that data, who stores it? And I didn't ask them this because I did off the record. They haven't really thought about it. I mean, who stores it? How long do they keep it? Do they have public access? I did ask them, just being the attorney in me, it's like, gee, have you used any of this stuff for any of the public permitting or any public hearings? And they said no, and we haven't got there. And because as a lawyer and as an engineer, if you're submitting data, there's issues with regard to how accurate it is from a drone, because we haven't done this before. It's like, well, how damn accurate is your elevation survey when you're 400 feet above and you're using, or how accurate is where you indicate that well bore is. And so all that stuff has not been, they haven't really thought out that really well. And I know the other, the Chevron presentation was really, unfortunately, I have not got his slides. But essentially what they did is Chevron was concerned that as a worldwide company, after Macondo, they said, we operate in a bunch of areas. We want to make sure we have best practices, and we are compliant, like we're our own regulator. And so what they did is they went through and they were, if they're going to have risks, advanced risks, they can identify those and eliminate them. So supposedly, and David, I'm not quite sure how this is different than just a risk management analysis. I mean, 20 years ago, we just called this risk management. You went and looked at all the problems, but now it's like, well, you got big data. We have all these databases, and we can tell you 95% of our risks have been eliminated. It's like, dude, I don't know. It might have been, of course, he's preaching to the regulators there. So what's he going to say? It's like, hey, we were a total failure. But that's just a joke. He did a good job. I'm sure Chevron, they know what they're doing. And time and time again with regulators, and I will tell you this is the regulators in general will tell me, they don't have the resources to deal with a whole bunch of data. So if you even drones, the North Dakota guy impressed me, Lynn Helms, because they have like 7 drones and 7 drone operators. Oklahoma has 1 drone that's on loan from the tax commission. Now, I don't know what the hell the tax commission uses the drone for, but the Oklahoma guy was like, yeah, we use it to go out. They're starting to experiment. And I don't know whether they're just getting visual or whether they're taking, looking for methane. I mean, you can look for temperature, you can look for methane, you can look for metal underground. So, what they're using it for, the Texas dudes, and the Texas Railroad commissioners, I know pretty well, and they said they're at the very infancy too. So the question is, first of all, get a drone, number one. Number two, if they capture data, what are they going to do with it? Number three, it's still a hell lot more convenient to go out on a pickup truck if you're a regulator than it is to fly over a drone. The people in North Dakota told me the best time for them to use a drone is like when it's 20 below in the winter and the roads are all snowed in, and the season distance. And so really literally goes, we don't have to, we don't have to get a snowmobile to go out and check the well sites. We can actually, we can go out and we can actually, or she goes, we could go upstream. He goes, and part of it is because some streams up there will have ice dams. And he goes, we can actually go up the stream and see if there's an ice dam forming and, warn the operator that, hell, you need to get out there. And which is interesting. But but the data, exactly what they're doing with the data, other than in Ohio, I knew they're using it to locate wells to be plugged. Chevron is using it to enhance their drilling practices. I was very impressed. And actually, we probably need to talk. Actually, this month is coming out. I was hired as a consultant at last November by the U.S. Chemical Safety Board with regard to the prior trust well that blew out here in southern Oklahoma, and it killed a number of people. And one of the things the Chevron people pointed out, and this struck me in his whole presentation, besides all their data, was that this well was drilled into a shale formation. Shales are not supposed to flow. And here and that was my first question. When they hired me, I said, well, you drilled into, and I forget what, I think it was the fails. I can't remember what shale formation it was. It's been a few months since I submitted my report, absent my professor, but apparently they drilled in. And of course, the people like at Matador Resources have told me out in the Delaware and some other basins where you drill into like some of the shales out there, you will get into sandy areas. The geologists have a name for that, where you get sandy areas in a shale, you'll actually flow naturally. And apparently that's what happened at the prior number. So, part of the problem, in my opinion, and of course I probably shouldn't even be talking about this, but publicly, if I was on a rig drilling into a shale, I would not expect it to have any flow back. And apparently they do, and it did. And, they're going to issue a extensive report, and I think it'll be interesting to see the final conclusions. I haven't seen them. They gave me the report and wanted my comments, and I gave them 10 pages of commentary just like this, and actually at the time I would have called you up and asked you, some technical questions that you could give me your feedback. Because generally, I'm not a technical guy, but I can, ferret out some of the technical issues that might come up that create legal issues. But it was scary. And actually, I will tell you this about the well, and this is before I even, after the well blew out, the next day, another professor at the University of Oklahoma Law School came in my office, and he goes, do you know a good criminal law attorney? And I go, well, no. And he goes, well, criminal law attorney that represents oil and gas companies, they're oil and gas people. And it's like, no. And he goes, well, and later I found out he was curious about, I don't know whether it was who was concerned, the service company, the driller, the operator, one of the workers, the mineral owner, but they were looking for contacts, and I haven't followed up, didn't follow up with them because criminal law and oil and gas law generally, they do not, hopefully don't mix. And
let's keep them as far away from each other as possible.
Issue, it's, the financial dude stole the money, so that's the criminal part of it. You don't get involved. I don't get involved because I'm involved in operational stuff. But the other interesting thing, I saw this online, was posted on LinkedIn. A satellite actually picked up when that well exploded. It looked like a big white puffball on the satellite. It's a weather satellite, wow. And which was striking. Which just indicates the power of it and how scary it was and how terrifying it was. And it's incredible. And I've met people or talked to people who are friends who actually have told me they knew people either involved with the service crew there or, the families of some of the people who were deceased. And they said it was just a total tragedy, and it was totally unexpected. So when the report comes out, I'll have to send it to you because there was stuff in there. When they told me, when you read this, there's some stuff in here that even with 30 years experience, you're going to have questions about. And I'll leave it at that. That's all I could say, because I'm still under it. When the report comes out, he's like, well, this is normally not what now, of course, I've been on like 3 drilling rigs all my life, and I sure as hell haven't drilled a well, so I don't really, but I can tell you legally some of the issues. And from an investor standpoint, it's interesting to see too. And talking to the engineers that do the actual fracking of this stuff, it's interesting. So anyway.
Well, Joe, thank you so much for answering all the questions. I know that you and I could probably sit here and talk for another couple hours about all of these different topics. I love hearing about all this stuff. I will say this for anybody that is watching. Oops, I forgot to put this over, so it's both of us. I will say this for anybody that is watching: if you are not following Joe on LinkedIn, you are missing out. Not only is he always putting out great content, it's relevant to what's going on in our industry, both from a policy standpoint to what's happening in general of things that are taking place, but also the historical stuff that's put on there. I think that's probably the most enjoyable because there's always something about one of the old wells that was drilled, or this was the first well here, or this was this. A lot of that stuff I really find interesting, just to be able to better understand the history of what takes place in our industry. So if you guys are not doing it already, click over there onto Joe Dancy's LinkedIn page, follow him, send a connection request, whichever. He's a great guy to be able to talk to. Loads of fun. We didn't really get very many questions. I think it was just a lot of people who were just intently listening, like myself.
Like I say, you give me a beer and you and I could talk all night, so it's fun.
I mean, there's so much stuff that's why I wanted to be able to have you on, is that there's so much that's intertwined that if you don't take a step back and look at the industry as a whole, you're not going to understand some of the reasons why decisions are being made. It's one of the things that being a field hand and being a coordinator and a manager, and as I've worked my way up, the further and further away you get from the field, you understand better what was taking place in the field and why it was being done that way. When you're so close to the issue, you're like, hey, I'm boots on the ground. Why are we doing this? This sounds stupid. And then you get a couple of levels up and you go, oh, that's why we did that, because had we not done that, it would have cost the company an exorbitant amount of time. It might have caused me an extra hour worth of hard work, but it ended up saving the company that's employing me a lot of money. So it's always great to be able to take a step back and kind of hear things, whether it's the regulator side or financial side. And I'm glad that you're able to provide some outlook on both of those. So I will say this to everybody, and I'll make sure to record this real quick. If anybody is looking for or interested in some work, there is $40 million worth of funds earmarked in the state of Ohio for plug and abandonment work, or not even abandonment work, just plug work, right?
Yep.
So if anybody's interested in starting a plug / not really abandonment company, if you guys are interested in getting that started, give me a call. I'll get Joe on the phone and we'll get this whole thing started, and maybe we'll get a couple of the SMU students to be able to invest in the company as well.
Yeah, some of our alumni, we have some pretty stout players. It's pretty interesting.
I think if we just get the right crew involved, we could probably get something going pretty quick. So, Joe, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really do appreciate it. We will definitely have to do this again in the future. I think probably after the next IOGCC meeting. Hopefully, I'll be there. I'm looking to be able to do some stuff here in the near future. So, thank you so much for being on. And for everybody that's watching, as always, know your industry.